Research Fellow at Tallinn University School of Humanities. He holds a PhD in Russian and Eastern European history from Stanford University and a BA and MA from the University of Tartu. He has several publications on Soviet and Nazi rule in the Baltics and is currently working on a book project on the politics of legitimacy and mass influence in Soviet. I'm muted. How did that happen? On the politics of legitimacy and mass influence in Soviet and Nazi-occupied Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 1939 to 53. So, Kristo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Eneken, for inviting me to this talk series. As you all heard, I'm a historian, not a memory scholar, and my presentation today is also a historical one, how communism was remembered in the years of 1941 till 1944 in the Baltic states, and it is a sort of an element of my dissertation, and so I'm trying to apologize here up front if I might abuse some of your vocabulary in memory studies, or if I'm not up to date with recent research in this field. But I still hope that I might give you something that might interest you, or something you might find useful. So the memory of communism, or to be more exact, the memory of anti-communism, is probably the most researched topic of the Baltic memory studies scholarship, as you well know. But it's almost exclusively a story of looking back from a distance, mainly from the perspective of the post-Soviet years of the recent 3 decades, when this memory was first articulated culturally and politically. Though there are a few exceptions, like Eneken's work, for example. But for the most part, it has been argued that before the 1990s, the memory of communism was at best a story of individual memory or family memory practiced in opposition to the official Soviet discourse, something that was private and not yet put in public narrative form. And this is where I come in, saying that, in fact, the memory of anti-communism was once before expressed publicly, just as the Balts had already experienced a post-Soviet period one time before. And this post-Soviet period was the Nazi occupation of 1941 till 1944, following the first Soviet year of 40 and 41, the brief but highly repressive year of Soviet socialism. The first post-Soviet years were an incredibly intense, if not explosive, period of collective narrative production about the Soviet Union and communism, something that informs the Baltic memory culture, I would say, to this day. Usually these Nazi-era discourses, as superficially as they have been studied so far, they have been dismissed as mere story of Nazi propaganda, or how the Nazis channeled local grievances toward their own goals. I wish to show, however, that it was rather something that Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians themselves had decisive agency in shaping, and by doing so, sometimes even inspired the Nazi regime, providing it with evidence and stories for its own anti-communist agenda. So this narrative explosion was made possible by the peculiarity of Nazi rule in the Baltics. Nazi dominance in entire occupied Europe was highly differentiated. So in my dissertation, I argue that the Nazis practiced something of an imperial-style politics of difference, establishing largely ad hoc arrangements with each occupied territory and ethnic group. Thus, in the Baltics, due to the relatively high racial value of ethnic Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, and the positive welcome with which the Nazis were received, Nazi rule in the Baltics turned out to be relatively mild, at least to these ethnic majorities. The Nazis not so much crushed local nationalism but sought to manage it. Metaphorically, Nazi authorities often spoke of allowing the Balts to let out steam on their nationalism. The German word Ventilgeben. And at different times, the Nazis allowed Balts to express their nationalism in various degrees. And this is why I have these 3 newspaper front pages of the Latvian newspaper Devija of the Nazi era. And these are, the dates are 18th of November, 1941, 42, and 43. And as you can imagine, the Latvian independence was, of course, problematic for the Nazi rule. And in 1941, when the Nazi rule is very self-confident about how the war is going to go, of course, they are silent about that it's Latvian Independence Day. But in 1942, you already see some expression on the front page of Latvian nationalism in this kind of safer form of female, of a woman dressed in ethnic garb. It is also mentioned that it is the former Latvian Independence Day, but as you see on the third picture, 1943, when the Nazis are mobilizing tens of thousands of Latvian men to fight the returning Soviet power, Latvian nationalism is given full reign. 18th November is on the top of the front page. It's all about the Independence Day, and it's allowed to be expressed almost without inhibitions. And you can see it's also men storming, fighting under their own flag. But if the Nazis had obvious issues with Baltic political self-expression, they allowed the locals almost complete freedom in expressing their grievances about communism. And the Balts were more than eager to do this. After all, only a year ago, they had suddenly lost their nationhood and tens of thousands of people to Soviet repressions. The most important of these repressions was the Soviet mass deportation of 45,000 men, women, and children that preceded the Nazi invasion only by 8 days. Moreover, the Soviets had conducted the deportations under a complete media blackout, with its own exacerbating effect. The combination of official secrecy and silence on the one hand, and the very obvious fact of this giant mass operation on the other, this combination produced a true mass panic about potential Soviet ethnic cleansing. And this mass panic is well recorded in the Soviets' own reports at the time. And this is a theme of another paper. But what is additionally important here is that the Balts came out of this secretive and existentially threatening Soviet rule with immense information hunger. What had just happened, not just during the deportation, but the entire Soviet year. What was this? What the hell was this? And when the Nazis arrived, the Baltic societies, both their elites and I should say population at large, stormed to satisfy this information hunger and to reconstruct the events of 40-41. The newspapers began publishing daily investigative pieces on the destruction of their country's independence. They wrote about the Sovietization of different localities and institutions, the nationalization of industries and companies. And these stories were accompanied by evocative images of national tragedy and sorrow, as this Estonian newspaper image shows tries to reconstruct how the deportations were conducted. Or this Latvian image, and if you are familiar with how the June deportation is commemorated today, it's quite a familiar imagery with this train tracks going into the distance. And but there were also numerous other modes of remembering the deportation, including poems, literature, music, film scripts, and at least one planned memorial complex for the deportees, even stained glass windows, as for example this Sigismund Wittberg's Widow of the Deported, which is in Sopa church in Latvia. I also wanted to show, mention with these photographs that I have this slide because I wanted to point out that these are actually some of the rare images we have of Soviet mass campaigns, which were done in Latvia and published under Nazi rule, and to show how rare these are is that how they are still used, even often with trying to illustrate other deportation events in the Soviet Union, or like just last week I saw eminent historian Roger Moorhouse using it to illustrate a post on Polish deportations in 1939. So there's this deficit of images, and the stuff that was publicized under Nazi rule are still here and still used because they're so rare. But this narrative mobilization was not just journalistic and emotional. Knowledge-making institutions were also involved. Local museums and archives rushed to collect historical materials and data about the Soviet year and made public campaigns to achieve this, appealing to every citizen's duty to preserve the historical evidence of communist crimes. Knowledge, they said, that was important not only for their own nation, but for the world at large. Here, Lithuanians were the most successful, since the Wehrmacht swept the country in a matter of days in June 1941. The Lithuanian partisans seized altogether 160,000 units of Soviet documents. So this was kind of equivalent to the famous Smolensk archive that the Nazis captured, and that was used later in the post-war years to basically establish the American historiography on Stalinism. These were the main primary sources. And Lithuanian partisans then transferred these documents to the so-called Museum of Red Terror in the Kaunas War Museum. Many of you know maybe this major museum in the center of Kaunas today, and where the documents were also widely publicized. They were put on display and so on. In addition, the museum made traveling exhibitions across Lithuania, which were visited by about 500,000 people. Another interesting museum was opened in Latvia, the former NKVD building, something akin to a modern experience museum. And this labyrinth of Chekist torture chambers, as it was called, about 100,000 people visited. And I can give you like a short summary how it was described, how the tour proceeded. So the tour began with the office space, with walls still adorned with portraits of Stalin and Beria. Then the visitors would descend to the dark and stale labyrinth of chambers. This is where the victims were once sitting in their tiny cells like sheep waiting for slaughter. One room had still bloodstains splattered across the white limestone wall. The visitors were also informed that the cells had housed several Latvian high officials, such as the head of Aisalgi, General Prauls, and Colonel Adamsons, as well as Colonel Streipa, the head of the Army Recruitment Division. And the displays referred to the execution orders signed by the housemaster, a Russian named Shustin. The guests were then guided to the core of the House of Horror, which was the torture chamber, where the victims had been beaten, electrocuted, pierced with needles, and having their nails pulled out, apparently by a young Jewish woman. And finally, the visitors were led to the execution chamber with its walls dotted with bullets and covered with special cloth to catch the splattering blood and brains, and the floor equipped with a special gutter to drain it. The visitors were told that the dead bodies would then be wrapped in a tarp. Apparently, you can see it on the right, it was apparently a trophy finished tent material captured by the Red Army during the Winter War. And then these tarped bodies were pulled onto trucks and taken to a nearby forest for mass burial. So the opening of this NKVD building is another great example how this highly secretive world of Stalinist state was suddenly open to the public, imploded into a certain narrative, probably a lot of fictional elements there, but it allowed people to kind of enter this very heart of darkness, as it were. And again, there was a lot of public desire for this sort of information and for this sort of experience during these years. It was a time of major revelations about the secrets of Soviet power and conduct. Many prominent Baltic figures gave their personal testimonies about the 1940 Sovietization. For example, the last Estonian Prime Minister Jüri Uluots on the left, who was the sole survivor of his 13-member government. The rest of his ministers, the Soviets had deported and mostly shot. Or the Lithuanian literature professor Vincas Grebenskiewicz. He was a high-profile defector from the Lithuanian People's Government, this Soviet puppet government, and he was the acting prime minister of it. But apparently, when he met with Molotov in Moscow, Molotov revealed his intentions, and this made him decide to leave the post and later to defect to the German side. And he later also testified to the American Congress about his experiences in the famous Kirsten Committee hearings. And all this knowledge gathering was also systematized, analyzed, and printed in book form. The most prominent were these three collections for each country. The Latvian Horrible Year, the 2-volume, the Estonian People's Year of Suffering, and the 4-volume, the Lithuanian Archive, the Bolshevik Year. These Lithuanian volumes consisted of 2,200 pages of scholarly articles, opinion pieces, and photographs, but also many facsimiles of original Soviet documents, showering the wartime public with data and well-crafted and usually sincerely written narratives trying to make sense of the Soviet year. Of course, not all this narrative mobilization was ideologically uninvested. Much of it included a large dosage of anti-Semitism, not only the one imposed by the Nazis, although there were a lot of Nazi instructions to the newspapers and in general in the media to promote anti-Semitism, but there was also a lot of homegrown anti-Semitism, and it is extremely difficult to distinguish the local and from the Nazi instructions, but there was definitely a lot of the local one there too, which is quite easily which one can quite easily observe. Still, and it is not an exaggeration to say that across the Baltics, the Jews were widely scapegoated as Soviet sidekicks and national traitors, if not the global conspirators seeking world domination. But yeah, basically there were two narratives of Jewish complicity here. One was the classic Judeo-Bolshevik myth, and the other one was that accused the Jews of preferring Soviet power to the nation state, thus collaborating with the enemy and betraying the nation. And the Lithuanian Studies Bureau, this 4-volume book that I just they produced this 4-volume book that I showed, and they were the people behind the Kaunas Museum of Red Terror. They were particularly anti-Semitic from the start, already before kind of the Nazis took over during this brief period of Lithuanian provisional government, and they actually verbalized it, like seeing as one of their mission to expose the world to the evils of Jewry, and this kind of strong anti-Semitism applies also to the Latvian book, the Year of Horror, which you can see on the left. I mean, almost every page had some anti-Semitic message. These so to say, Jewish faces peeking behind the text. There were a lot of these kind of design antics, how to express this anti-Semitism. But here I should add that it's also important to stress that this sort of anti-Semitism was not the only story in town. Instead, there was a flurry of interpretations as to why the Soviet Union was what it was and did what it did. And the Judeo-Bolshevik thesis and the Jewish collaboration thesis were just some arguments among several others. The Nazi-era public sphere became something of an early laboratory of Sovietology. Many authors, for instance, blamed the communist crimes not on the Jews, but rather on the Russians. Others on the Asiatic or Messianic Slavophile strand of Russian culture, as opposed to the European Pushkin and Lermontov Russia. So Pushkin and Lermontov could be said to be like the positive figures of Russian history in the local media. And still others blamed the deep geocultural forces behind the so-called inert Russian peasant masses, easily swayed and led to blind destruction, this kind of Ruski Bund thesis. But most dominantly by far, the authors blamed not the Jews or the Slavophiles, but the age-old strivings of Russian imperialism, harking back to Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, the familiar Eastern invaders. Russian imperialism was the main story, and especially at the end of the war, it almost eclipsed the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, which was more popular in the beginning of the war. Historians often frame the Nazi-era anti-communism in the occupied USSR as something that the Nazis imposed on the local population. But this framing is incomplete, as it ignores the extent to which the occupied populations themselves participated in forging these narratives, providing evidence for it, and perhaps even inspiring the Nazis. The German-Latvian documentary, The Red Mist, for instance, could rely on such evocative atrocity footage that it was remade in 5 versions: Lithuanian, Estonian, German, Swedish, and French, and was planned to be dubbed into 20 languages for maximum dissemination. Irina Chelneva has written a very thorough article about it. I highly recommend it. Local publications based on original evidence were often translated into German and publicized abroad. For example, the same Latvian book, Baigais Gads, the Nazi authorities were so enthusiastic about the book that they translated and printed it under the title Das Jahr des Grauens in 30,000 copies. Only at the 11th hour did Joseph Goebbels personally pull the brake on actually disseminating the book. Intriguingly, Goebbels argued that the images of Bolshevik victims in the book were simply too horrid for the German home front consumption. These images could harm, he said, civilian morale, with people worried about the fate of the German POWs in Soviet captivity. So Goebbels decided against it, but they still are found in archives. So I found this from the Hoover archive, and it's interesting also that it's actually made on a better quality than the Latvian version for the German consumption. But much of the Baltic experience did reach Germany and Western Europe. For instance, Estonian self-administration chief Hjalmar Mäe made speaking tours in Germany, Austria, Denmark, and Slovakia. And foreign journalists also visited the Baltics. Journalists from Vichy France, occupied Norway and Denmark and the Netherlands, and even the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo sent its delegation to Estonia. During the war, the Balts became something of continental experts on the Soviet Union and its ways, serving as a cautionary tale on what it was like for a European country to fall under the communist yoke. And here I should emphasize that the production of this anti-Soviet remembrance was not only an elite project, it was also the wider societies that actively participated in it, whether in the form of satisfying their information hunger, identifying victims, or empathizing with them. People were trying to track down their loved ones, attending exhumations, funerals, and church services, including in the smallest localities, or simply feeling sympathy for the fate of their co-nationals. And here you can see the office of the Special Estonian Institution tracking down the deportees and the Red Army mobilized Estonians. And these lists were regularly updated, and people could visit these spaces. In all 3 Baltic states, the deportation date became the official national days of mourning, with special church services and commemoration events, which were widely attended. One could add to this popular participation also the widespread volunteering to the various Nazi auxiliary forces, from local police to the Waffen-SS units. But I won't venture into that here. It's a big topic on its own. But I will mention the hundreds of thousands of civilians who participated in the major social welfare organizations as donors or receivers of aid to the families of the deportees and the families of those fighting in the German armed forces. And even though these organizations operated under the aegis of the National Socialist People's Welfare, they operated under their own national symbolism and on the infrastructure of the former Red Cross or independence-era welfare bureaucracy. And these organizations were extremely popular at the time, and people remember them very fondly, never even associating them with anything Nazi or with a Nazi regime. Many, if not most, civilian Balts experienced their work under Nazi domination as politically not collaborationist and nationally guided and committed to the home front against communism. And I think it's legitimate to speak about the substantial Baltic home front culture and mindset under the Nazis, even if it seems somewhat paradoxical. So, kind of long conclusion. The Nazi era explosion of anti-communist narratives in the Baltics left a powerful legacy for the local societies, both short-term and long-term. In the short term, the wartime anti-communist mobilization clashed head-on with the returning Soviet power in 1944. The returning Soviets met the Baltic societies undergoing something of a peak nationalism, a major societal challenge to Soviet power for at least a decade to come, which is known with the Forest Brothers resistance, for example. Of course, the Soviets returned with their own Baltic national cadres and their own Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian Red Army troops. But these evacuees coming from the Soviet rear had an extremely hard time competing with the far more dominant and grassroots local stories. The vast majority of Balts, let's say about 95% at least, had spent the war under Nazi rule, and it was Nazi-era culture that shaped their wartime experience. And here one can also think of the later ethnic bifurcation of memory culture between the Baltic titular nationalities, ethnic Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and the post-war Russian immigrant population who came with their own stories forged elsewhere, not to mention, of course, the local Jewish survivors who quickly began verbalizing their own interpretation of the war, and actually Latvian survivor Max Kaufmann was one of the first to publish a book on not only his experience of Holocaust, but doing kind of a history of the Holocaust, which was published, I believe, in 1947. So these stories were already produced very close to the war as well. But the wartime anti-communist memory work also left its long-term legacy. The emotions articulated then and the knowledge produced became the core of post-war Baltic history and memory about the nature of Soviet power, not only in Western diaspora communities, but also at home. During Perestroika, when Baltic dissidents began openly talking about the 1941 deportations, they naturally picked up the old narratives and convened in the same memory sites as in the 1940s. Late Soviet newspapers republished the Nazi era facsimiles of Soviet documents, and June 14th was quickly re-established as the National Day of Mourning in all 3 Baltic states, just as in 1942. And here I like to make a separate point that there is a myth of sorts that these Nazi-era discourses were mainly retained by the Baltic nationalist diaspora, and then in the 1990s, as if they imported these to the post-Soviet Baltics. And but I think it's quite incorrect. Many of the Nazi-era publications survived the Soviet era. Many people had lived through the Nazi era. And these publications that survived till the 80s and 90s were widely read by the Balts in the Baltics. And in fact, often it was the diaspora figures who had to reproach their post-Soviet brethren to stop idealizing the Germans and the German era, and maybe to cut down on their anti-Semitic expressions and to try to accommodate their stories to the Western liberal democratic understanding of the war. In other words, much of the Baltic World War II memory culture was forged already during the war, in the same language, with the same evidentiary references, tropes, aesthetics, and that are often invoked today. Today, one can again visit the NKVD House of Horrors in Riga, just like in 1942. The wartime Kaunas Museum of Red Terror has a bizarre afterlife, possibly in the planned Museum of Red Terror in Tallinn, though I believe they become aware of the weird connections, so I think they have changed the name. And as of today, the Nazi-era academic works about the first Soviet year have gone through several reprints. They are easily available online, and their stories and language continue to inform academic histories and popular culture alike. If someone mentions in Latvia the phrase "baigais gads," everyone knows which year it refers to. The same legacy pertains to the Estonian people's year of suffering. This book is not only the most, probably the most reprinted Estonian history books of all time, 5 reprints as of today. Even its title has become a powerful meme, invoked time and again at critical moments when the nation is facing a collective catastrophe, such as economic crisis. As one time Estonian Prime Minister said, 2008 will be Estonian people's year of suffering, or ecological crisis, Estonian nature's years of suffering, an Estonian ecological bestseller. And my final point, the World War II origins of the Baltic memory culture might also explain why this memory remains so ethnocentric and resistant to integrating alternative World War II experiences, e.g. of its own minorities, Jews, Roma, Russians, Poles, even though the latter have always told their own stories, many of them likewise originating from popular wartime discourses. There simply are no well-chewed words and well-publicized images to express them. And it is difficult to say if the many attempts to bring these stories together will ever succeed. Collective memory seems to be forged like iron, highly moldable under critical heat, but much harder to work on once the iron cools and the firmness settles. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will find the hand clapping reaction soon, but we can do a digital round of applause. I have so many questions, really. I think this presentation really speaks to a lot of the themes that the Translating Memories project and a lot of the people in the audience, whether they're on the project or not, really work with. So I guess I can use my position to ask the first question, and then we can open it up to everybody. I think it's not just in the Baltics or in Eastern Europe. There is a lot of reckoning right now, kind of a global moment of looking at different nations' heroic narratives and looking into the biographies and actions of people who are or maybe were in separate cases considered to be national heroes. And as an American, I can think a lot about the debates over the founding fathers, about who the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were really written for. Just looking at the text itself, it was really for landowning white men, which is not, it was not freedom for all. So really looking at these foundational figures and documents. And I think, it's clear that in the Baltics, it's different in every country, but there is some tension over some national heroes who may have been partisans or may have been really, really prominent in the fight for national independence, who were also perpetrators of Holocaust violence, and that it's very difficult to get those two narratives to meld. It really seems like there's people and institutions really subscribe to one or the other. But in our project, we really talk about trying to figure out how to portray perpetrators in terms of why they did what they did, not to excuse, but to explain. So I'm wondering if you see a way forward that could sort of portray people as maybe perpetrators of one regime of violence, but then victims of another, and victims who didn't deserve the violence that they experienced. It was unfair, maybe no matter what they had done earlier. Or do you think that for the time being, this really cannot be? And why would that be?
I actually wondered if my conclusion sounded a bit too pessimistic. I think, I still have some hope in a sense that, what you were talking about is a very big, topic in the Baltics, especially in Lithuania, where Holocaust took such proportions that there were so many perpetrators in, but it affects also Latvia and Estonia as well. If we think of Friedrich Kurk, who was the head of Omakaitse, and how he agreed to arrest all the Jewish citizens, men, women, and children, and he agreed this with the German commander. And he's at the same time, considered the partisan hero. So I think, my hope is, like, as a historian, is that people, will publish about it and people will read about it. And actually, we do have a lot of sources about Holocaust in the Baltics and about the perpetrators and what they thought. These same books that I mentioned, there's usually, they include anti-Semitism, like all these books, but usually these anti-Semitic parts are dismissed as, oh, these are like signs of the time, or they were imposed, and this has nothing to do with the good part of the story. But I think, if people would read them and see how organically connected they are, they would maybe take other opinions. But I think what is also important is to have the alternative stories present. Which is possible in Lithuania and Latvia more, because we have a lot of Jewish, for example, memoirists. There are wartime diaries that have been published. In Estonia, with very small Jewish community, with very few survivors, almost no survivors. There are very few kind of documents that can come to public awareness. But there are, for instance, the kind of SD investigation files where Jewish Estonians appeal for mercy in Estonian, and but these have never been publicized really. Unfortunately, maybe some newer textbooks have them. I don't know, but I think there is some hope in understanding that there are many stories, and this official story of the German occupation that people have adopted as their personal memory, although they all remember the same newspaper stories. I think there's an opportunity to realize that this is only one of the stories, and it's not that personal necessarily.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have another question from the audience?
I have two.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for this extremely rich material, and I was particularly struck by these examples towards the end of your talk, where you show the reverberations of these visual and textual metaphors and icons in post-Soviet times. I mean, I knew the book Eesti rahva kannatuste aasta, but I never actually have realized how it has, let's say, the metaphor has been used in different contexts in post-socialist times. So thank you so much. I have two questions. Firstly, you started out with the claim that the Nazi occupation in different Central and Eastern European countries was quite different. So there was this politics of difference. But what about within the Baltic states? So was it similar in all these three countries? And the second question is about the local collaborators, like Soviet collaborators. We know that some of them left with Soviets when the Nazis came in, but then the others were several thousand people were killed, shot, and the others repressed. So do these people at all figure in these narratives about first Soviet, the first year of Soviet occupation? So are they actually discussed in these media narratives, and those who help to deport people and so on? Or is it just really like a communism, something that came from outside, from Russia? You actually listed all these coexisting anti-Soviet discourses, but were the local collaborators discussed at all?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with the second one. It was discussed quite heavily, and I mean, they were present. There was some kind of element of how to frame them in the context of should we blame our collaborators or should we blame the Soviet power? And of course, the Soviet power was blamed more, and the local collaborators were often portrayed, some were portrayed naive, but some were also portrayed as bloodthirsty communists and so on. And I mean, there were heavy repressions against communist collaborators, and this victimization happened. It depended on localities. It depended mostly, I mean, these were Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian policemen who kind of found them and who executed them, or sometimes they decided that this active Komsomol member was just young and stupid, and will let he or she go. So this was very little actually German involvement in that, in kind of settling the scores with the Soviet collaborators, and there were many who survived the war under Nazi rule. And there were also these interesting campaigns. For example, during Christmas of 1941, a lot of the Soviet collaborators were released as a kind of a Christmas celebration thing, that you who were collaborating just a little bit, not perpetrating crimes, we, the German, so these were done by the German officials, that we, the Germans, allow you to go home and celebrate Christmas. So you can return to the fold of the nation and, to the values, to the traditional values and so on. But yeah, they, so it's a bit different, yeah, in terms of like how many people were killed in Lithuania and so in Estonia, the communists killed, Trump, the Jews killed, because there were so few Jews in Estonia. In Latvia and Lithuania, the numbers are the other way around. There were more Jews killed than communist collaborators. So there's this this difference. But it's kind of interesting how I would argue the population kind of accepted the executions of these communist collaborators, because if we think of like commemoration today, I mean, nobody cares to commemorate these 7,000 people killed for collaborating with communism in Estonia. We have commemoration sites for Jewish victims, but nobody really cares about these communist collaborators, because most people kind of, this was justice, or it might have been harsh, but it was justice, and I think people still accept it, and nobody cares to erect a monument for them, and they have no community who would want to do that. But as to your first question, it's a long story. I mean, the difference between the three Baltic states, but definitely in Estonia, the German local relations were much more cordial, better. There was a lot of delegation of power to the Estonians in Estonia, and the local German General Commissar Litzmann kind of tried to portray his realm as this poster boy of how the Nazis should govern the peoples of the imperial realm, and in Lithuania, where you had a very strong partisan movement, the whole provisional government episode, there were many more frictions between the two parties, and the German local relations were quite bad. And I don't think in Lithuanian culture you hardly have this kind of nostalgia for the German occupation as you might have in Estonia, and Latvia is somewhere in between those two extremes. But in Latvia too, there was a lot of delegation of power, and the local collaborators could express their issues, and they could negotiate and with the Nazi authorities. In all three countries, we have local, like, Nazi collaborators, people in the self-administrations appealing for independence at some point. So there was a certain political opportunities, or the politics was in a way possible at the time. There were a lot of negotiations how to govern the territories, more than, let's say, in Belarus, which was just kind of brutal Nazi rule with very little collaboration. Yeah, I mean, I could go on.
Thank you so
Yes,
much.
thanks.
For the questions and the answer. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to pose? Or maybe a comment?
I have maybe a bit of a random question,
Yeah.
But I've noticed while living in Estonia that there aren't that many. I don't think I've seen any Roma people here, whereas in Finland there's a considerable minority of them. Is that lack of Roma people here because of this period of time?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are Roma people in Estonia, and there were. I don't have the statistics, but I mean, they were victims of the Nazi rule, and maybe even the most, I don't know if it's the most tragic aspect of it, but it went completely unnoticed. I mean, it wasn't even a propaganda theme to oppose the Roma somehow. There's very little information on how the Roma were killed, or I think Latvians have done some more interesting research on this. Uldis Neiburgs, I think, has written about the fate of Roma people in Latvia. But in Estonia, there's I mean, there is in the major volume Estonia 1940-45. I think there is something about it, but it's not part of the. Well, my presentation was about these kind of public discourse about it, and this is completely almost absent. I mean, I can go over the newspapers if they're ever mentioned, but they were wiped out with no kind of care or no interest in them even. So it's a tragic story in its own right, and how the perpetrators might have seen it, I don't even know. But I mean, the interwar Estonian police and the Baltic police definitely kept their tabs on the Roma community, and so there's certainly some historians have suggested that there's a certain prehistory to the discrimination of Roma from the interwar years to the Nazi era in the local police bureaucracy and so on. I'm sorry, this is all I can tell you right now.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Anyone else with a question or comment? If not, I have another one. So I was thinking about the volumes you were showing from each of the Baltic countries that were produced during the Nazi occupation, talking about the horrors of that year of Soviet occupation. And I'm wondering, as a historian, how do you navigate kind of the provenience of some of these sources, where some of the information, right, is accurate about how people were deported and how people were massacred. And I'm not an expert, so I couldn't say how accurate the numbers of victims and so on and so forth are in these books, but conceivably some of it is accurate information, maybe even most of it. But the fact that it's coming from something that had such strong support and such obvious ideological connections to Nazi anti-Semitic or otherwise, racist ideology, how do you navigate using sources like that are so obviously ideologically tinged, even though some of the material might be accurate? And it could go the other way as well, right? With Soviet sources about the Holocaust that were written later, where some or most of the information is accurate, but the ideological tint is really, really prevalent and kind of almost taints, right, the entire thing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, I mean, the solution is not to use them like that as the sole sources. Yeah. I mean, these are already kind of secondary sources, although they include some documents. But I mean, maybe the interesting part is but for example, I should mention that the Estonian version has these first chapters are not written by like ideologically invested Nazis, but for example, the same Jüri Uluots, who about his experiences, how the Soviet power established itself, and there are I think these personal accounts are actually the interesting, like how much do we buy the Lithuanian, this kind of deputy or acting prime minister Vincas Mickevičius, his story, like how authentic is that? And the Lithuanians are still struggling with it. There was a whole letter exchange in the 50s, like whether his meeting with Molotov, like he remembered it slightly differently under Nazi rule and later in the United States. So like, is it authentic, or did he make it up in the process? Books like this, the Latvian one, I mean, they have really no historical value. I mean, this is just this kind of propaganda text that refers to some documents, but these are not of any value. But there are certain myths that stem from these texts that prevail to this day. For example, how the flag from Big Herman in Tallinn was taken, the Estonian flag was taken down by a Jewish son of a Jewish merchant. And this is actually a story that is very easily debunked, because there's an actual photograph of the communists who took it down, and they were all Estonians. And this has been debunked by I believe the head of the local the Jewish museum here. But this story is like the Nazis at the time believe it. They write it even in their internal documents. So it's so believable that he did it, and then these myths prevail today, and some historians do refer to these volumes as kind of legitimate secondary sources. But I think this is really not necessary anymore. We have other sources, and these books are worth studying on their own right, I believe.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm not a historian, so it's a question I hadn't really thought about so much. Anyone else would like to join the conversation? I don't know. Is there anything else you would have liked to have added to the presentation, or something that's come up while we've been talking afterwards?
Oh, yeah. I guess I should add that this, in terms of this kind of narrative pluralism, it's kind of one thing one can also explore is also these kind of stylistic differences. For example, this Lithuanian poster, I mean, it's quite modernist, and so I've studied posters before, and it's fascinating how like some of the Latvian posters are made by Latvian modernists, and some of them even follow the school of Gustavs Klucis, this kind of who was a Russian avant-gardist. So there's a Russian avant-garde style posters published under Nazi rule. But it's funny, but I mean, what it actually testifies to is how little censored the media was. In a way, there was censorship, of course, but there was a certain pluralism that was allowed. It wasn't like the first Soviet year, when basically the whole media system and media conventions and how everything worked was imported from the Soviet Union, and basically there was almost no local kind of pluralism possible, and this again tells about the kind of the local agency, and it's kind of, as a historian, I think it's very difficult to articulate how do you explain it in these kind of situations where you do have Nazi domination, you do have Nazi instructions every couple of days to the newspapers and so on, but there's definitely also a lot of local media production that is written sincerely and with its own ideological agenda. And I think this is something we should talk about, that there's a certain density to the Nazi rule that I feel like the historians haven't really addressed. There's a lot of stuff written and produced at the time, and I think this is worth studying more. It is not only about propaganda or some Nazi instructions and all that story. There's much more cultural production that is there and that is kind of forgotten, that has been forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, yeah, really interesting angle. I think Anakin had another question.
Yes, I wanted to ask a final question about the methodology, because you started out by saying that you are a historian and you're not sure if you're able to say something relevant for the memory studies, but I think your methodology actually is very relevant for memory studies, because it looks like something like a discourse analysis, so my question is about how you analyze, how you like understand it from your perspective as a historian. Is it discourse analysis, media analysis, or what is a specific approach that actually allows you to say so much relevant for memory studies, all these images and icons and metaphors and so on?
No, I mean, I'm not doing any really, I don't know if discourse analysis would be the correct term. I mean, I like the idea of Jan Assmann's that basically memory isn't only something, or events are not, people don't make sense of events only later, but they do it already at the time. And these narratives are created in the midst of things, and I mean these there is some other scholarship that is kind of doing similar things. Lisa Kirschbaum, I think, has studied, for example, the Leningrad blockade, and how a lot of the memory of Leningrad blockade was also already, there was certain people were starting to collect information already during the war and narrativizing this. And so it's broadly this, I mean, there's some historians who do this very, since, there's a lot of digitized newspapers, so they measure, how many, like of all the caricatures, how many of them were anti-Semitic, and how many of them, for example, blamed the Soviet Union without anti-Semitic images. So I think, something can be gleaned from that, I guess. What were the dominant narratives? I don't have this kind of quantitative aspect. I'm just want to show the diversity of it. And it's indeed like it's only an aspect of my dissertation, but I guess like how I ended up with it is that I actually started studying the Nazi propaganda institutions and how they worked, and how they what kind of instructions they gave. And what you discover is that these instructions and this work is only a surface level thing, and it doesn't actually describe the entirety of media production at the time. And this contrast between this kind of supposedly totalitarian Nazi discursive imposition isn't really that story. It coexists with a lot of local stories. There is, if you open a newspaper, there's a lot of material that is just taken from Nazi newspapers and follow, all the required, all the bullet points. And then there's an article about like a famous Estonian modernist painter, like Karl Pärsimägi, and it has illustrations of his reproductions of his modernist works, and nobody knows that he's actually killed in France together with his Jewish wife, as we know now. And or this art by Anna Triik, which is published in the German newspaper, which doesn't follow exactly some Nazi conventions or Nazi gender stereotypes, let's say. So there's a lot of stuff that is produced without direct instructions. So this is the way I kind of got into it.
Great. Thank you so much. And If anybody has a last question or comment, please make yourself known now. Otherwise, I think we can say thank you again to Kristo. I will find the clapping hand emoji this time. And people can have their time to prepare for celebrating Friends Day or just Tuesday evening. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And we'll see you at the next speaker series talk.